Hi, and welcome to Classical Stuff You Should Know. I'm here to introduce the most professional one of us, Thomas Magby, who is here with your introduction.
Hello.
Thomas.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for having me. Let me bring my prepared remarks. 7.
That was the least professional thing. You've
been lambasting us for not being professional.
Nailed it. Hey, this is Classical Stuff You Should
We
Know.
elected Thomas to do the intro because he was the most professional of us, and now he's just, quoting Lincoln?
Yeah, why not? He's
Lincoln's
pretty professional, right? I don't understand.
Lincoln's a pro.
My name is Thomas Magby. I'm joined as always by Mr. Graeme Donaldson.
Hello.
And Mr. AJ Hannenberg.
Yeah.
And I feel like this disappointment is just a part of our introductions at this point, right? We are here for parts, 27, 19.
Sure.
What are we at?
I mean, it really depends on how you count it.
Okay. This threw me off. You mentioned this. So apparently this War of the Roses and Plantagenets, we should consider this one series.
One.
Yeah.
Because we have two. This is our second last episode.
Okay.
And at the end of next episode, like the last Plantagenet, the Plantagenet bloodline is done.
Yeah.
And so really this goes all the way back to the White Ship tragedy back on the first episode with Henry I, all the way back.
I think I've been counting the audio files as Plantagenets all the way.
Have you? Okay.
Yeah.
But you've been, but we bill them as War of the Roses 9 or whatever it is.
It's on YouTube. Yeah. I think the titles are listed separately. I think there's War
Gotcha.
for the titles of the podcast itself.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I'd have to look, but I think that's how it is.
Anyway, gentlemen, where we last left off, Henry VI is dead. Mm-hmm. He was bludgeoned to death.
Yes.
No.
Edward
Died of a broken heart, right?
He died of a broken heart. He died of extreme sadness.
And it bled all over.
And it bled all over the place. It was real weird. And Edward IV is now king.
Okay.
And Edward IV, all he wanted to do was just chill, maximize his chill, because he had a bunch of kids. I think he had like 8 children.
And this is the war bro, right? He's
This
super
is the
good
war
at war,
bro.
super good. And he married the surprise girl.
He married the surprise girl who was like not of a noble bloodline. She was just a good old-fashioned Northern English pub girl.
Just a cutie.
Yeah. And so she's not like, she can't trace her bloodline down to the French, the continent. She's just a good old lass from the northern country. And people were scandalized. Elizabeth Woodvale, but she was cute. She was older than him. And she'd been married before, had some kids. And so some of those kids, they play a role, but not a big one. He married her. And at the end of last episode, his brother Clarence, George, Duke of Clarence, was just being a little twit. And wouldn't stop being a dink. And
how's he being a dink? Can you be more specific?
So he when they were distributing lands, Edward IV was distributing lands, and he gave his brother Clarence and his brother Richard equal amounts, but Clarence didn't get his favorite castle.
Yep.
And so he was real upset about that.
Gosh.
Clarence, if you remember, betrayed his brother and went over to the Earl of Warwick.
Yep.
I remember.
And then
He's lucky to be alive.
And then went back.
Yeah.
He was real upset when his wife died in childbirth, and so he accused the midwife of being a witch and killed her, which
I remember that.
put her on
That
trial, which is something only the king can do.
It's pretty low, my guy.
Pretty low. That's pretty, and
Unless she
and
actually was a witch.
she wasn't. But here's the other thing: there were these
sure?
two guys. Well, I don't,
How do you know?
who?
Yeah.
I mean, see if she floats. See if she floats, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so, but there was a time where these two guys were put to death for actual sorcery.
Okay.
And they were put to death because they predicted the death of Edward IV, and they said he's going to die on this day.
And?
Not cool, not allowed to do it.
Yep.
And so the king put him to death, and he came, and then George Duke of Clarence came in and was like, I posthumously declare those guys to be cool. And everyone was like, you can't do that. He was like, they are not bad people. And Edward IV was just like, Clarence, like, buddy,
Can't do that.
we won. We're in the ascendancy. Like, stay in your lane.
You are unmaximizing my chill.
That's right. You are a problem. And it got to the point, and of course, Edward IV never really forgot the whole betrayal thing when
how could you?
Clarence thought that he could become king. And it came to a head, and they got into a fight at Parliament, and Clarence was executed. And he was drowned in a barrel of wine.
I remember that. Okay.
Yeah.
And people think that Clarence, when he was pronounced that he was going to die, he didn't believe it because it was his brother. And so he's like, and he was given the option of choosing his mode of death. And Clarence is like, I want to die with like drowning in wine, baby. And Edward IV was like, yep, done. And then did it. And so Clarence is dead. And people were like, meh, he was a bit of a traitor back in the day. So people were not okay with it, but like they understood. Okay. They understood. This is a family squabble. You know, brothers kill each other, and every now and then, like this is not going to upset the realm.
Well, you don't want him coming back with an army anytime soon. Nobody wants that battle.
Right.
It's just, it's easier if he's in a barrel.
Once a traitor, you know, always, maybe not always a traitor, but everyone's going to, he was going to have a hard time escaping that past.
Right.
In any sort of future things.
Genghis Khan would have killed him.
Yeah, Genghis Khan would have killed him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Edward IV, now Parliament, if you remember, wanted Edward IV to do one thing, and that was retake France, and Edward was not into it. Does not want to retake France. But they kind of twisted his arm, so he half-heartedly invaded France, and France did not want a military prowess guy on their shores.
Didn't they offer to pay him a bunch of money?
That's right. So they basically gave him a salary for life to not invade them, and he was like, done.
Awesome.
And then he came, and they sort of were like, oh no, you conquered us. And he was like, oh, I conquered you. I'm going home. And he went to Parliament. He's like, I conquered France. And they're like, that's not really what we wanted, but okay.
Donaldson, I've been thinking real hard about conquering your house.
Yeah.
So if you feel like giving me a salary for life, like $20.
I know. I say, come and take it. It's like property taxes are going up.
Yeah.
And you know, Texas has some pretty high property tax. No. Anyway.
You might actually have cannons on your property. Like the come and take it thing.
Raise that flag.
Yeah. I could see that happen.
No, I'm a man of peace. I'm a man
okay.
of peace. You can come stay with us whenever you want.
Well, that's not.
He wants the salary. Yeah, he wants the $20 a month. Yeah.
So
I'll just come and stay in your hotel room and then just send you emails about how I conquered your land.
You cannot stop me.
I'm here.
Now, there was a second reason why, and we didn't talk about this in the last episode. There was another reason why Edward IV kind of wanted to invade France, and that was he had one last little loose end. Henry VI is dead. Margaret of Anjou, her son is dead. She's not playing the game anymore. She's out of the game. She's in the court of Louis XI or whatever, and she's like, I freaking hate the English, and she's not going back. But there was one guy, and his name is Henry Tudor. Now, Henry Tudor is a Welshman, and this is a deep cut. We're going to have to go way back in our lineage to figure this one out. Henry V was the king that conquered France. And he married a woman named, Catherine? Catherine. I think he married Catherine. So Henry V
Catherine of Valois?
married Catherine of Valois.
Yeah.
Married Catherine. And Henry V had a son named Henry VI. And we know Henry VI. That whole story, dopey king, that sad thing. Yeah. Henry V died real young, which started this problem. And Henry VI became king at 9 months and then was given the regency to, I think it was like a Somerset or a Humphrey or a Hastings or whatever. People who have been listening, people who just like speed listen to these episodes probably know who it is, and I forget because it was like a year and a half ago.
Right.
But anyway, so Henry V died, and Catherine was the queen regent, and her son was Henry VI, but she went off and she married Owen Tudor. Yeah. Out of love. Yeah. And Owen was he was a Welshman, and he was kind of noble. Now, the Welsh think he was super noble, but the British are like, a noble Welshman? Let's like, why don't you...
Didn't they kill him?
Yeah, they killed Owen Tudor. Yeah. They killed him later. But they're like, a noble Welshman, why don't you just put like a suit on a dog or whatever, right? Like, they didn't care. The English don't think that... Aww. I don't know. They don't think
Can you
that...
make that the picture for this episode?
Probably.
Is a suit on a dog?
Suit on a dog?
But anyway,
if you have a tiny suit, like Rennie in a suit would be...
Oh, that'd be adorable.
Awesome. So cute.
That'd be adorable.
Yeah,
I'd make him king of England.
Yeah.
So Owen Tudor married a French queen. That's awesome. Yeah. And the Welsh so apparently he could trace his line to, get this, friggin' King Arthur.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
The mythical king of the Welsh. So his line had some currency in Wales, but the English don't care about that. And she married him, and she had a kid. She had a bunch of kids. And then those kids had kids, and one of those kids is named Henry. And you will remember, or maybe not, Henry's mother was named Margaret Beaufort. Mm-hmm. And if you remember all the way back, she was married off when she was 13 years old because she was the richest girl in the world. Mm-hmm. And she had a child at 13, and it was real traumatic. And she swore that she was never going to have another child. And that child was Henry Tudor.
Oh, okay.
So the rich girl that got married at 13 and had a kid had a really terrible birth. And it almost killed her. It was during the plague. She was like stuck in a castle. It was awful. And she gave birth to this boy named Henry, Henry Tudor. And just to make it, well, he's Henry Tudor. He's got a better name coming up, which will make it easier for us to remember him. And she swore she would never have another child, but she ended up having a bunch of husbands, but never had another kid because she was like, I'm not doing that nonsense again. She's rich. She doesn't need to have kids. Anyway, Margaret Beaufort, just we need to remember her, the 13-year-old who had the child, Henry, and now she's older. Henry Tudor was therefore Henry VI's brother. Is it half brother? Same mom.
That's a stepbrother.
Is that a stepbrother?
Yeah.
Same mom, different dads.
Same mom, different dads.
Mm-hmm. And mom was Queen of England.
Half brother?
Half brother.
Okay, there you go.
Anyway, half brother or stepbrother
is where
you
you
marry, but the kids already
marry and the
exist.
kids are already in the
half
mix.
brother.
Yeah.
So Henry Tudor is Henry VI's half brother from the same mother. And when Henry VI died, and when the Prince of Wales died, and we remember the Prince of Wales died begging for his life on the battlefield after his first battle. It was real sad.
Oh, real sad.
Technically and theoretically, if you wanted to follow that claim, Henry Tudor had a claim to the throne through that side of the Lancasters.
Okay.
Meanwhile, the Yorks are in control, and they're like, okay, and they don't care about that claim. But if you were like Team Lancaster, you would say, hey, there's Henry Tudor floating around, and he's got a claim to the throne. Henry Tudor has lived his life on the run. His first 10 years of life, he was stuck in a castle, in a siege, and then he eventually fled to France. And but he is the last Lancaster, and he also is has a claimant through the Welsh line to friggin' King Arthur. Edward IV knew about him and had just defeated the Lancasters, and he didn't really think that Henry Tudor was going to be a bit of a problem, but people began hearing that Henry Tudor was kind of awesome. He was just capable and was kind of a put together kid. I'm just trying to see if I can find a good. Churchill has a good line about Henry Tudor, where let's see if I can find it. Maybe I can't find it. Sorry, I know this is riveting listening. Can't find it, but there was this time when people would see Henry Tudor, and he was 15 years old, and they were like, "Oh, that guy's a king. That guy's awesome." And Margaret Beaufort, the mom, was told this a lot, "Hey, your kid's pretty great, and he should, and if you're a Lancaster, he's the true king of England, if you're a Lancaster." And she really took this to heart. And there was one line that I was looking up in Churchill, but I couldn't find it. That someone said that she took to be a prophecy, that my son is supposed to be the king. So Mom Beaufort has this in her mind, her only kid, because she was never going to have another one because it sucked.
Right.
And so she was like, okay, I want my kid to, he could be king of England, and he should be, and this also means that, naturally, the Welsh would be on their side. The Welsh are always a thorn in the side of the English, and the English are always trying to stamp down the Welsh. But here it's hey, if push came to shove, and there's no pushing or shoving, Edward IV is pretty good right now, but if push ever came to a shove, the Welsh are we have a chance, boys, of being in charge of the throne again.
We got a guy.
We got a guy. It used to be Arthur, and then the English, all these Frenchies came into our land and conquered us, but maybe we can come back.
Yeah.
So, the Henry Tudor was somebody that the Welsh had their eyes on. Okay. Edward IV kind of half-heartedly attempt to get Henry Tudor when he conquered France, or when he went to go fight in France. There was apparently there was this one scene where Edward IV sent his lieutenants to go get Henry Tudor, and Henry Tudor was like, well, this is it. I'm going to die. And when they burst into his room to take him into Edward IV, he's like, guys, you can't take me. I feel really sick. I don't feel good at all.
Did that work?
It did. And all the guys were like, okay, well,
We'll come back.
We'll come back later. And then when they came back to Edward IV, and they're like, he had like a really bad fever. Edward IV was like, okay, then I'm glad you didn't bring him because I don't want to get sick.
Okay.
And something's going around, and I don't want to get it. So,
Well, how long after the plague was this?
Plague, yeah.
Were they just a little gun shy?
Well, I
Guys,
guess
I'm so sick. Ooh.
the thing is, this wasn't like
They didn't
top
want
of mind.
yeah.
They didn't like this wasn't like in a fair state. The king was like, "Hey, Henry Tudor's over there. Can you go get him for me?" And when they came back, they're like, he wasn't feeling so great. So we left him. And then Edward was like, "Fine, whatever. I don't care."
History's crazy.
Edward was like, he's
Can't believe
probably
that
not
works.
going to invade and take over England anyway. And
'Cause he's sickly.
Because he's young, and I've secured my throne, and I'm Edward IV, and I've got like a Brazilian children anyway. I've got so many kids.
Brazilian.
Yeah, a lot of them.
Is that more than a Brazilian, I'm
More-
assuming? Yeah, good.
He's got,
Brazilian?
I've got
good.
so many kids that if I die, like there's tons of kids, and I'm not going to die because I'm like young and I'm a warrior and I'm awesome. Cool.
Okay.
All right, so half-hearted attempt to get Henry, and Henry's Henry sort of escaped capture a bunch of times. There was one time where another half-hearted attempt came, and Henry sort of like heard about it, so he just like got on a horse and ran off, and they're like, crap, he got away. All right, and then so like Henry, so
They're just not trying real hard.
didn't try real hard. So Mom, Margaret Beaufort, she is in England, and her son Henry Tudor is in France. And Mom Beaufort decides that, she got married again, and she got married to some dude named Lord Stanley. And Lord Stanley is a Yorkish bro.
Okay.
Like, he is friends with the Yorks, and that's the power and control. And so this Beaufort, who has the last Lancaster claim to the throne, but that no one really ever believes is going to materialize, she's now married to Stanley, Lord Stanley, who is a Yorkish bro, and people are like, the world is healing. People are marrying each other. Edward IV is in charge. The troubles are behind us. And she comes in, and her number one mission was she was trying to set the table to allow Henry to come home. She probably didn't think to be king. She just wanted him to come home and like have some estates and marry well and all this, the stuff that all mothers want for their awesome prince children.
Right.
Okay, so she marries Lord Stanley, and Lord Stanley is an ally to the Yorks, and he is such an ally to the Yorks that he is made basically like the right-hand man of the king. He's like, Edward IV is like, Stanley, you're my dude. And so, the court was now, well, Clarence is dead in a bottle of wine. You had Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was the king's brother. And he was known as the boar because that was his standard. It had a boar, a pig on it. And so you had Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was powerful. And then you also had Edward IV, the king, with his two sons, the Prince of Wales, and the new little 9-year-old Duke of York, so cute. Mm-hmm. And then you had Lord Stanley, who was married to Margaret Beaufort, and this was the court, and everything was looking great. And Margaret became real good friends with the Queen. Queen Elizabeth Woodvale. She became such good friends with the Queen that when Elizabeth Woodvale had her last baby, I think the kid's name was Bridget. I don't know. Had their last kid or whatever. Margaret Beaufort got the right to carry the child into church, right? So she was friends with the Queen. Everyone was. So Margaret Beaufort, she was trying to, befriend everybody to someday be like, hey, Edward IV, my son, he's in France, and he's been in captivity his whole life. You're the king. Nothing's going to happen. Can you give some kind of like ancestral homeland back to my son? And she got this opportunity, and she did. And Edward IV says, Margie, I'm going to do that for you.
Wow.
I'm going to make Henry the Earl of Richmond. How's that? And Margaret's like, that's awesome. Henry's Earl of Richmond. Wow. So from this point on, he was now going to be known as Richmond in our story. So Henry Tudor is now Earl of Richmond. He's now known as Richmond.
Okay.
It's a lot easier.
Okay.
So
easy.
And then Margaret Beaufort is like, listen, Edward IV, you know my son. And he's like, yeah, your son's pretty great. Like he's pretty, he looks like he's Lancaster, he looks like his grandpa, awesome guy. She's like, you've got a bunch of daughters. what do you think maybe we could do like a Lancaster boy and a York girl married together? What a beautiful picture of the new solidarity under Edward IV's line. And Edward IV is like, let me think on it. And Margaret was like, okay. But people were like, this was the match that everybody kind of realized should happen. It was the obvious match. Elizabeth, the eldest daughter, is the eldest daughter of King Edward IV. She needs to marry. She could go marry, like, I don't know, the King of Jerusalem or whatever. But then you've got this Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who was a Lancaster. And if you had the Lancaster and if you had the York and if they got married, that would be really great. The Prince of Wales would be the next king, but the Earl of Richmond would be married to Elizabeth. This sounds like, some peace through happy marriages. And so Edward IV is like, let me think on it. And so, cool. But everyone kind of was like, this is going to happen. It just makes too much sense not to happen. This was in 1483 when Edward IV says, let me think on it. But then on April 9th, 1483, Edward IV died.
Whoa.
Just died. We don't really know how.
Just from nowhere?
Just from nowhere. Now, there was a couple of things. Edward IV, when he was a young man, was a warrior. And he was a hoss, and he would throw down. But what did our friend Edward IV love?
Ladies.
He loved the ladies. He loved to chill. And and after this, he loved to party. He got pretty fat. And he may have chilled so extreme that he died.
Wow. That's a lot of
Died from extreme chill.
Just like clogged arteries?
Now, he didn't, either a heart attack or a fatty liver now he didn't have any sort of like STDs or anything, because usually that's like a long, drawn out and very scratchy. So he didn't have that. So he didn't seem to die from some sort of like disease
Syphilis
that way.
surprise.
Yeah. But he got real sick real fast, and everyone was like, oh, dang, we need to make a will pronto. Yeah. And so let's see if Churchill talks about the death of Edward IV here. There's a lot of, like, at the time, there was an Italian, dude who, let's see if I can find it. No, this isn't. Anyway, sorry. There was this sort of Italian chronicler who was in the town and was like chronicling the life of Edward IV. And this Italian was shocked of how lecherous Edward was. He's like, there is not a woman that this guy does not hit on. And there is not a cup of wine that this guy does not chug. And there is not a party that this guy does not go rage at. And so, so there was, so maybe that's how he died. He was too fat. Maybe he had too much loving, too much feasting. And when he
could have been cirrhosis of the liver.
Could have. And when he died. He was his most recent mistress her name was Jane Shore, was with him as he died. So he was like, he had these mistresses and he had all sorts of all these sorts of things, So this wasn't. So he sort of just died of partying too hard. This is a problem.
But he has two sons, right?
He has two sons, and the eldest son is 12 years old.
Okay.
That's pretty good as far as kings go.
Yeah.
So let me just see. Say something. Talk amongst yourselves for a second.
Did you watch Power Rangers when you were a kid?
Wow.
I had a Power Ranger themed birthday growing up.
No way.
Absolutely, 100%. I actually just recently found pictures of that. So,
really?
Yeah. So
I had a Ninja Turtles.
All right, fine. Okay, cool.
We were all dressed up as Power Rangers except for one kid. I don't know who it was, dressed like Spider-Man. It was incredible. It's one of the best things I've found.
All right, so here we go.
That's bold.
Thanks. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Here's what Dan Jones says about the death of Edward IV. Oh, sorry. So this is what Jan Jones says about the death of Edward IV. Years of increasingly debauched living had finally caught up with him. Feasting and fornication were the prerogatives of kings, but even by royal standards, Edward had thrown himself wholeheartedly into excesses. He had numerous mistresses. The most famous was Elizabeth Shore, a fast-tongued mercer's daughter from London, whom the king shared with Lord Hastings. So, and Lord Hastings had this, co-mistress. Not great. And at least 2 illegitimate children by different mothers. There was a boy, sort of fantastically named Arthur Plantagenet, born to an obscure lady of the court around 1472, and he was much later created Lord Lisle, a daughter Grace, and probably many more. Edward, quote, loved to indulge himself in ease and pleasures. wrote the historian and diplomat Philippe de Commyon, who had seen the king in action firsthand during the peace negotiations of 1475. He was, quote, given to bodily lust, whereunto he was of his own disposition inclined. And the Italian dude who followed Edward around to sort of like see what he was like said, in food and drink he was immoderate. It was his habit to take an emetic for the delight of gorging his stomach once more. After his recovery of the crown, he had grown fat in the loins, whereas previously he was not only been tall but rather lean and very active. So we don't know how he died, but dude was pretty fat. Some people say that he died out of God's vengeance for eating too much food on Good Friday, but who knows if that's true.
Okay.
So Edward is dying and really quickly needs to make a will. And this is where things get a little bit dicey history-wise. Now, I'm going to make one disclaimer from here on out. From here on out, we get the actions of his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. And so much of the history of Richard, Duke of Gloucester was sort of like a generation later. A lot of the history we know of Richard, Duke of Gloucester was written a generation later by people who were painting Duke of Gloucester as like just an absolute terrible person. So it's because it's going to be Richard. He's going to be King Richard III.
Right.
And so he is the last. He's going to be this Yorkish. So Richard, Duke of Gloucester. We have a biography of him written by Thomas Moore, like 80 years later. That is basically paints Richard as like the devil himself.
Right.
And so anything that we know about what's happened is always going to be a little bit, we don't, like all of the motivations are going to be a little bit skewered. So I don't want to paint Richard as too much of an evil character, but the dude is shrewd and pretty bad. There are things we do know, but anyway, I want to put that disclaimer out here that
He's pretty bad, but he's not the devil.
he's not the devil, and there's probably some understandable things that he did. And but anyway, so on the deathbed, this is what we know, is that Edward IV was supposed to, everyone knew we are going to need a protector for the realm, because a 12-year-old king, that's not going to fly. Even if he's going to be crowned king, and he's going to be Edward V, but little Prince of Wales, Edward V is 12, and we're going to need a protectorate, and it is obvious, slam dunk obvious who's going to be protectorate. It's going to be Richard, Duke of Gloucester. And on the deathbed, this supposedly Edward IV said, Duke of Gloucester, you are the protectorate. Edward V is going to be king, but you're going to be protectorate until he's of age, and then until like everyone sort of realizes that this dude can throw down himself, and maybe when he's 15, 16, but not 12. And so Duke of Gloucester was like, yes, my brother, I will be the protectorate, and that was a thing. Okay. So the deathbed, Edward IV dies, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is going to be the obvious protectorate. Then we have, so there's two sons. We have Edward, Prince of Wales, who we'll now call Edward V, because he's King Edward V. And we have Richard, Duke of York, an adorable little 9-year-old Duke of York. You can imagine he's like a little Duke of York uniform. Anyway, so Richard, Duke of York. And those are the two boys. They are with their mom, Elizabeth, at this beautiful castle called Ludlow Castle. And they find out their dad died, and it's real sad. But Edward V is like, guess I'm king now. And Duke of Gloucester, everyone assumed that Richard, Duke of Gloucester would be the protectorate. Okay. At this time, the Prince of Wales, let's talk about this Prince of Wales, Edward V. He's 12, and he has had this amazing education because he was sort of growing up at the time of peace. The best knight in the realm was his personal tutor. And he was a guy known by the name of the Earl of Rivers. Now, you will remember the Earl of Rivers as he was a headstrong young lad that almost got into a knife fight to the death with the bastard from Burgundy at a festival. Yeah. Edward IV had a festival, and he brought the Burgundians over, and this bastard of Burgundy fought, and he was fighting this young knight named the Earl of Rivers. And the Earl of Rivers, so Rivers and the knight fought, but it kind of got heated, and they like drew real daggers, and Edward IV had to stand and be like, whoa, bros, like stop, stand down. And then the bastard Burgundy was like, I like these Yorks, and they became good friends, and the Burgundians and the Yorks were allies. And Rivers, everyone was like, ooh, Rivers, he feisty, he's a good knight. Earl of Rivers was considered the finest knight in the realm. Let me read to you a little bit of what was talked about this Earl of Rivers. Hannenberg, you are going to love this guy. So
I'm already in. His name is rad.
His name is rad. Earl of Rivers is Cotton Voxen. All right. So he is the tutor and the sort of the head guy of this 12-year-old boy who idolized him. Loved, because he is this, like, the most dashing, chivalrous knight in the realm, and you're the future king, and he loved Rivers. He thought Rivers was just, like, the perfect knight incarnate. So here we go. Earl of Rivers. Rivers had fought the Saracens in Portugal. He had been on pilgrimage to Rome and Santiago. He was on good terms with the Pope and was an enthusiastic man of letters. He collaborated with the pioneering merchant William Caxton, who in 75 and 76 had brought a printing press to England for the first time. Wow. Rivers made use of Caxton's new technology to publish English translations of the Diks and Saying of the Philosophers and Proverbs of Christine de Pizan, as well as numerous of his own works of moralizing verse. Caxton wrote approvingly of Rivers that he, quote, conceiveth well the mutability and the unstableness of this present life, and that he desireth with a great zeal and spiritual love that we shall abhor and utterly forsake the abominable and damnable sins which commonly be used nowadays, such as pride, perjury, terrible swearing, theft, murder, and many others. So he was someone that, like, lamented sin and was a man of letters and wrote poetry and wanted to, like, write it and produce it. Dan Jones continues on. He was, in short, the model tutor for a young king growing up in a time of war and burgeoning knowledge, and his presence at the boy's elbow had evidently been reassuring to the old king both in life and upon his deathbed. So as Edward IV was dying, he's like, everything's going to be okay because Rivers is taking care of my boy.
So he's a true warrior poet.
He's a true warrior poet. Awesome. Earl of Rivers is great. He is rad. And this is the time of the early Renaissance, and he was like, this Renaissance thing's, it's the future, guys. Like, we got to be reading this stuff. And everyone was like, man, we should just drink. And Earl of Rivers, he was literate, and he was raising the king, and Earl of Rivers is awesome. Okay, so he's in charge of the Prince of Wales. When the king dies, all of a sudden, Earl of Rivers is in perhaps one of the most powerful positions in England. He is the idol of the king, and he is in charge of the king's person. He has the young Edward V with him. And that is both incredibly dangerous and also, like, incredibly powerful. When a king dies early and the king is really young, everyone gets a little butt clenchy. What's going to happen? You know, we just went through terrible times. Edward IV was supposed to stabilize everything, and now he's dead. We have a king. We have Edward V that should be king. We've also got a pretty awesome brother named Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who's now the protectorate. I sure hope Richard, Duke of Gloucester doesn't want to be king, because if he did, that would be a problem. Okay. So the will was Richard is protector, and Hastings is going to be Richard's sort of right-hand man. And if we remember Hastings, he was
the right-hand man of the king, right?
Yeah. Oh, that was Stanley.
Oh, I'm thinking Stanley.
But Hastings was the guy that also had the king's lady mistress in common.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. So he's kind of a ragamuffin. But anyway, Hastings, so you have, on the one side, you have Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and Hastings, who are going to basically run the protectorate. So they're going to, like, take charge of the politics. Mm-hmm. And then you've got Rivers, and he's going to take charge in raising Edward V to become king one day. So you got this, like, two-pronged thing. This was the exact same setup that was done with Henry VI. Exact same one. So you've got, like, his uncle's going to take in charge of the realm. And you're going to have this awesome rad king, knight that's going to be in charge of the king. And then he's going to grow up, and this is going to work out. Okay, cool. At this time, once there was a prophecy that was, like, going around the realm that was gaining traction, and that was, we are going to have 3 kings in 3 months. That was the prophecy. Okay. There was this weird prophecy that people were saying there was going to be 3 kings in 3 months. And people were like, oh, that sounds bad. Cool. All right, that's going on. Okay. We don't really know anything about the Richard, Duke of Gloucester's motivations at this moment, but what we do know is that the Queen, Elizabeth Woodvale, was dead set against having Richard be the protectorate. And she got basically, there was, once the death was happened and the will was sort of like rolled out, Parliament sort of voted and was like, yeah, no, that's not happening. Edward V is going to be king right now. No protectorate, 12-year-old king.
Wow.
Print it. Happening. Coronation is happening. Send that boy to London. And so Richard, Duke of Gloucester was like, okay. Send Rivers, you and the boy come to London. And Rivers is like, oh, we're coming with 2,000 dudes because, just in case. And Richard, Duke of Gloucester was like, fine. Awesome. Okay, cool. Richard, Duke of Gloucester was in the north fighting the Scots, as one does. And he's like,
it's like a summer pastime.
Yeah. He's like, we'll meet you. So Richard said, here's what we'll do. Me and Hastings will meet you on the halfway to London, and we will all march into London together. And it'll be like, sort of it'll maximize the glory. And Rich Rivers is like, awesome. And so, okay. So Edward V and Rivers are going to London with these 2,000 dudes, and they meet up with Richard, Duke of Gloucester on the way. And that night, so as they're going, all these 2,000 dudes need places to sleep. And so what they did was they kind of all just sort of like disbanded to all these little towns around and slept in all of these inns and whatever. So this isn't an army. They're not pitching camp. So at nighttime, everyone's like, all right, Hannenberg, you and 5 guys, you go to that hotel. And Magby, you take 6 guys and you're going to that hotel and that kind of thing. And Richard, Duke of Gloucester was doing the same thing with Hastings. And so, Richard, Duke of Gloucester wasn't with Hastings. He was with his buddy named Buckingham. Okay. So Richard, Duke of Gloucester and Buckingham invite Rivers and this guy named Richard Grey over for dinner. They're like, hey man, let's have some dinner together. And then we'll march into London tomorrow. And Rivers is like, awesome. They come over for dinner. It is a jolly affair. Richard, Duke of Gloucester and Buckingham are in good spirits, and Rivers and Richard Grey are in good spirits. I think Richard Grey he's the Queen's son from the earlier marriage. Can't remember, whatever. And they talk late into the night. Turns out they got tons in common. Rivers wants to know how the fight in Scotland went, and because they're both able-bodied warriors, and they've both been Yorkists. They both were beloved by the late king. Rivers was cool at that tournament, and Gloucester, was the guy that killed the old Prince of Wales. Or was it Clarence? Can't remember. Anyway, it was Clarence. But anyway, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, he's thrown down. These guys are they got on together. They talked late into the night, and then it was really pleasant, and they all sort of stayed the night in that inn. When Rivers woke up, he went up to get ready for the day, for the glorious march into London, and his door was locked. The door to his hotel was locked, and so was with Richard Grey, and then a very stern-faced Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and Buckingham walk in and say, you have been meddling with the king, and we are here to place you under arrest. And they place Rivers under arrest, and they place Richard Grey under arrest.
Oh, whoa, yeah. What?
For what?
Why?
For but we don't really know. Basically for turning the king's head and not adhering to the will, which was that Richard should be the protector. Yep. And Richard's like, technically this kid is under my protectorate now because I'm the protector of the realm. And you have been you've been turning his head. The queen is meddling, and you're under arrest for crimes. And arrested Rivers, and then immediately rode off before word of this got around to the 2,000 men, galloped like no man has ever galloped before, him and Buckingham, and caught up with the little boy king as he was waiting for Rivers, and they came up to the king. They arrested all the other men that were around the king, and they were like, my lord, we've saved you.
Oh, how many times is this going to stink and happen? Where they're like, we've saved you from these usurpers.
Right.
And we saved you. So they rode up. Apparently the 12-year-old boy, is no dummy. And he knew what was up.
Right.
And he said, he knew what was up.
He was also a big Rivers fanboy.
And he's a massive Rivers fanboy.
So this is going to be a problem.
Exactly. So here we go. Dan Jones says this about Edward V. Edward V was only 12 years old But he quickly saw through his uncle's Gloucester's fine words. According to Mancini, the youth replied, so this is what the 12-year-old boy replies when his uncle says, "We've saved you from these malicious, bad people who are trying to turn your head," saying that he merely had those ministers whom his father had given him. He had seen nothing evil in them and wished to keep them unless otherwise proved. As for the government of the kingdom, he had complete confidence in the peers of the realm and his queen. And the queen. And then Buckingham, when he mentioned the queen, was like, "Women can't rule. Your mom's a loser." And Edward realized that at this point the dukes were demanding rather than supplicating.
Right.
So Edward V is now under the, quote, protection of Richard III. And this is what Churchill says of this encounter. Richard then rode with his power to stony Stratford, arrested the commanders of the 2,000 horse, forced his way to the young king, and told him he had discovered a design on the part of Lord Rivers and others to seize the government and oppress the old nobility. On this declaration, Edward V took the only positive action recorded of his reign. He wept. Well, he might, says Churchill. So, Edward V is now in the safe hands of Richard III. Rivers is in jail, and Richard then rides with the king, Edward V, to London. The king is wearing royal blue, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is head to toe in black. So they ride in, and immediately Richard says, "Hey, buddy, listen there, champ. We got to postpone your coronation just for 7 weeks." And Edward's like, why? And he's like, "We want to make this as grand a thing as possible. And plus, in 7 weeks, Parliament's going to open, and then we can do it like 2 days before Parliament. You can have the coronation, and then you can stride into Parliament. Everyone's going to be here. Let's just do that." And so they did. So
are they still demanding rather than supplicating?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Edward V says, or Richard, Duke of Gloucester says, "Oh, and hey, buddy, it's a dangerous world out there, and there are bad guys who are coming for you. I know the safest place for a 12-year-old boy.
Tower of London?
The Tower of London."
Yeah.
So, Edward V knew what was up, couldn't do anything about it, and was put into safety in the Tower of London. Queen Elizabeth, when she heard this, so this is Elizabeth Woodvale, immediately took all of her remaining children and fled to Westminster Abbey, where she would be safe. She has her daughters, and she's got little 9-year-old Duke of York, her only other son.
Right.
So all her girls are there, and the Duke of York, and she is there basically being like, he can't kill me here. Edward V is safe in the tower, and at this point, Hastings is not cool with it. Hastings is like, whoa.
Right.
Not cool with putting the 12-year-old boy in the tower. Do not like this. And this is all happened within like a month of the death of the king. Like, this is real fast. And Hastings is like, I don't like the fact that Duke of Gloucester seems to be consolidating power, and him and Buckingham seem to be like moving real fast with this. They basically put the kid in the jail. That's bad. So Hastings is not cool with this, and he starts to like correspond with Elizabeth, and he's like, I think something's up. This ain't great. Richard is kind of losing the plot here. At this point, Richard, both people that I've read in this said that at this point, kind of like a crazy vibe kind of like descended upon the English. Like this was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was all of a sudden making real big, fast power moves, and before you knew it, a 12-year-old kid was in the tower.
Right.
And it wasn't scandalous because he was saying, hey, he's being saved. He's being safe. Like, kings have been in the tower for their safety before. Henry VI was in the tower for his safety. But people were like, whoa, this is happening so fast. And one thing that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had control of is his brother had basically started the England's first postal service. And Richard, Duke of Gloucester, realized the power of holding the information organs of the realm, and he knew that he needed to, whatever he wanted to do fast enough before like things got out for the country. So But when Hastings kind of turned, Richard began to get paranoid. So Richard, Duke of York, he was getting a little paranoid, and actually he was so paranoid that Hastings was writing letters saying like, yeah, Richard's kind of being paranoid. He thinks that I'm out to get him. Hastings was like not happy with things that are going on, and Hastings is like, I kind of think Richard wants to be king, wants to be crowned king. I don't know what he's going to do with those boys. Anyway, Hastings
Does he have a claim? Does Richard even have a claim?
Yeah, his brother was king. Oh, yeah, his brother was Edward IV. Yeah. So
right.
he does have claim.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so he thinks that Richard, he's like, Richard kind of wants to be king.
Somehow I missed that.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like I feel silly.
It's all right. Richard, Duke of Gloucester.
Is there a reason? Could he have been named king initially, like Edward IV?
If those boys weren't there, yes,
it would go down.
And
okay.
Edward IV could have delegitimized his children, but he didn't because they were his children.
Right.
But if before those boys were born, if Edward died, then Richard would have been king.
Got it. Yeah.
But when those boys were born, Richard wasn't going to be king.
Makes sense.
But if those boys aren't around, then Richard could be king. Anyway, Hastings is like, I kind of feel like Richard is kind of like, he's getting paranoid, he's getting kind of weird. And anyway, Hastings had a daily stand-up meeting with his dudes every morning, and Richard sometimes attended and sometimes didn't. But on one daily stand-up meeting, Richard showed up, and let's see, so Hastings sort of one day just sort of showed up to his meeting, and Richard was there, and halfway through the meeting, Richard was like, you know, commenting on how delicious the strawberries were and talking to the clergyman about stuff. And then at some point he just stood up and said, Hastings, you're under arrest for, trying to undermine the throne and you're trying to kill me. You're trying to kill me, you're under arrest. And they like took him outside, put his head against a block and chopped his head off right then and there.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Quick move. Wait, was this in the tower?
This was just in like his house.
Wow.
They
Who has a block?
Yeah. It was like a chopping block for wood.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, like, as I walked in, like, whoa, hey, whoa, what's this thing over here?
So whether or not this is about Hastings, whether or not he had fully worked out Gloucester's ultimate ambition, that is the only plausible explanation for what occurred on Friday, June 13th. Hastings, Rotherham, and Morton all assembled for a routine council meeting at the Tower at 10 o'clock in the morning, as was their custom. According to Mancini, they walked straight into a trap. When they had been admitted to the innermost quarters, the protector, Gloucester, as prearranged, cried out that an ambush had been prepared for him, and they had come with hidden arms that they might be the first to open the attack. Thereupon the soldiers who had been stationed there by their lord rushed in with the Duke of Buckingham and cut down Hastings on the false pretext of treason. They arrested the others, whose lives it was presumed was spared out of respect for religion and holy orders. So, it was a summary execution of the most breathtaking ruthlessness, and the writers of the time marveled. And this was the quote that floated around. Whom will insane lust for power spare, if it dares violate the ties of king and friendship? Hastings was one of the closest allies to the Yorkish cause during the war, and now he is being brought into his courtyard and his head chopped off right then and there. The king didn't do it; the king's in the Tower, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, did it right then and there. Chopped his head off. People freaked.
Yeah.
There was a crazy vibe descended upon England, and people were upset. At this point, Richard somehow, because this was happening so fast, people didn't really sort of clue into what Richard was doing. At this point, Richard somehow convinced Elizabeth, the Queen, that the Duke of York, the young 9-year-old Duke of York, should also come and be with his brother, the king, so they can be brothers and they can grow up together. And Elizabeth was like, okay. And so she did, and she sent the 9-year-old Duke of York to Richard, the protector of the realm.
Well, what happens if she says no?
Oh yeah, what's she going to do? He's going to come and take him? So she sends...
wasn't she in Westminster Abbey at this point still?
She was in Westminster Abbey.
Yeah.
And so she's
I would have said no.
She says, okay.
Yeah.
And so she sends... Yeah, she should have said no.
Right.
But
I feel like people being killed all over the place. I'd be like, no.
But the thing is, it's happening so fast, and it's like... this Hastings thing, this could have been an internal squabble of an old grudge from the wars. Right. And, so no one really thought that Richard was going for the crown, which is what he is. People were, because they thought this is family. He's their uncle. He's going to protect it. maybe we would have been cooler with Rivers, but his uncle, this is family, right? He's not gonna kill family. Hastings he doesn't like. He put Rivers in jail, but these boys are his blood and the bloodline for the throne. Okay, so Richard is now, both boys are here. And when the little Prince of, when the little Duke of York shows up, he gets put into the tower with his brother. And then that next Sunday, Richard's bishop, one of Richard's sort of allies, who's a bishop, preaches a sermon. And he preaches a sermon, and in that sermon, he alleges and makes the case that these boys are bastards and they are illegitimate, and that the marriage to Elizabeth Woodvale is illegitimate because Edward IV was actually betrothed before he married Elizabeth Woodvale to a lady named Lady Eleanor Butler.
Wasn't she referenced last time?
Yes, Lady Eleanor Butler. That was what Clarence basically had said to Edward IV, which was like, "Hey man, if you don't give me the castle I want, like I'll tell everybody about Eleanor." And that was when Edward IV was like, "How about you die in a barrel of wine?"
Yeah.
And now, this sermon is preached that Edward IV was illegitimately married to Elizabeth Woodvale, and all of the children are illegitimate bastards, and Edward V is not the king. Now, Richard's not preaching this. This is just a sermon.
Okay.
And everyone is like, "Don't believe it. No, that is a obvious stupid thing." And the whole crowd is like, dumb, and not a thing. But Buckingham had like planted people in the crowd to be, "Long live King Richard," in hopes that if that one person yelled it, the crowd would yell it.
Right.
And so Buckingham's guys were like listening to the sermon. They're like, "Long live King Richard," and all the people were like, "Shut up, it's church." And
How awkward would it be to that one guy?
And so they did it over and over. "Long live King Richard." And then the bishop's like, "Oh yeah, these bastard children shouldn't rule the realm. God will not, God will smite us for it." And all the people were like, "I don't buy it." And then the paid actors were like, "Long live King Richard." Anyway, and then all the people after church and this basically got London all riled up. And then Buckingham made a great show of going to Richard's house and knocking on the door and being like, "My lord, Duke of Gloucester, these children are bastards." And Richard was like, "I don't believe it." And it's like, "No, sir, they are. They can't rule the realm. You need to be the king. You're King Richard." And he's like, "No, I'm not King Richard."
Oh, brother.
And he's like, "No, Buckingham." Buckingham's like, "King, you are King Richard." And then the paid actors were like, "Long live King Richard." And the crowd was like, and then Richard said, "I begrudgingly accept."
Yeah. Okay.
And then was crowned King Richard III. Okay. And the crowd was like, "This feels gross." And
Yeah, it doesn't feel good at all.
this does not feel good at all. And Buckingham was like, "Your king, ladies and gentlemen, isn't he majestic?" And the crowd is like, yay. They're going to kill me? I don't know.
Right.
And so people are not into it. Nobody is stoked about Richard III at this time. And Richard is like, "I am your king now. These poor bastard children, they can't be king."
So is this the third king in 3 months? Is that the deal?
Yes.
Yeah.
This
So
is
he's
now-
the third one.
He is now the third king.
Because
in
then
3
we
months.
had the main king, and then he died and that was
Edward
his
the Fourth,
son.
and then Edward the Fifth, and Richard the Third.
Richard the Third.
In 3 months, and people were like, "Oh crap, the prophecies come true."
Who's cranking out those prophecies?
Yeah,
Is what I want to know. Like somebody knew.
People know. Okay, and now we have a terrible thing. As soon as Richard III becomes king, he goes and just like indiscriminately executes Rivers in jail, kills him. Rivers is gone.
Dude.
I know.
What a go-
Rivers is no more.
Like to cut off someone in the flower of their chivalry.
Yep.
Wow. That's terrible.
Uncool.
And there was half-hearted cheers when he's king, and then and this is 1480. This is still 1483. Those two boys are seen no more. They are in the tower, and nobody knows what's happened to them. Now,
For how long? Is it just like forever?
forever. Well, let me tell you. So in 1483, the boys were gone. In 1674, so like 200 years later, when they were doing some remodeling in the tower, 2 young skeletons of boys were found buried underneath a stairwell.
Wow.
Now, this is where the story we don't know what happened, but obviously the boys died in the tower.
Richard killed.
And the story goes that Richard got his little hitman, whose last name was Tyrell, and Tyrell went to the tower one night, and we have the record of him signing in, and Tyrell was given the keys to the tower. Every single room in the tower was given the keys for one night. And the boys were never seen since. The famous legend is that Tyrell smothered the boys with a pillow and buried them under a stairwell. And then in 1674, when Charles II was remodeling the tower, they found the skeleton of a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old boy underneath the stairwell. But those boys were killed, and Richard is king, and people were like, "Hey, even if they're bastards, we love those little boys, the Duke of York, and even if they're bastards, we should see them." And Richard's like, "Bad news, they're dead," and people were like, "You did it." Immediately, the whole country was like, "Richard, you killed them." He's like, "No, they're dead." Nobody bought that, and so I personally am convinced that Richard killed them. And like we pretty sure Richard killed Henry VI.
He was killing all kinds of people. It's just
he was killing all kinds of people. Right. But this is
you can't have somebody growing up with a claim if you have just taken the kingship.
This is a crime. I mean, like people. You're right, Hamburg, to say that people were killing all sorts of people. But this is a.
It's beyond the pale.
This is beyond the pale. This is killing a family.
Well, especially if they're illegitimate, then they didn't have a claim to the throne. Like you just killed a 9 and a 12-year-old who, I don't know, like, yeah.
So either they're illegitimate or they're legitimate and you just murdered two kids. Yeah.
But this is more than like killing a little kid.
Yeah.
This is a bigger deal.
Right.
And so no one really is going to forgive Richard for this. And the thing is, Richard as a king, he's going to be king for a while. And in our next episode, he's actually going to do some like pretty clear-headed reforms, and he's going to do some pretty smart things. And everyone's going to be like, "You're a jerk," because he killed those kids. And this is not going to help him because he's already has like paranoia. And even though he like starts doing some good things for the realm, everyone's like, "Oh yeah, tell it to your dead nephew, you jerk!" Right? So, anyway. And that's where we're going to end today. Is that let me if I can find. Apparently, the boy kind of knew, the 12-year-old boy knew that the jig was up and was daily calling in a priest to the tower so that he could give penance. Sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance because he believed that his death was facing him. So this is a pretty, that's a pretty dark chapter in history. And this is, Richard III has never escapes that, that he killed those two little boys. And now he's the king. And there is the only claimant that exists is
Henry Tudor.
Is Henry Tudor, who's in France, Earl of Richmond. And Richard III is now king, and he's got his own little kid. And so he immediately makes his own little kid Prince of Wales. And if you remember, his daughter was Warwick's daughter, his wife was Warwick's daughter, and his little son is now immediately Prince of Wales. And Richard III is like, "Okay, let's get back to business. Nothing to see here. My brother's dead, and his bastard children are in the tower, and now they're dead, and I'm king. Like, stop being upset about it. I'm king."
Which there's no way that works.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And so now sentiment and mood is starting to turn. They're being like, "Oh gosh, this guy's kind of a jerk."
Yeah.
And people are like, "Is there anybody else that is in line?" And everyone's heard about this cool Earl of Richmond in France. And people are like, "Wasn't he supposed to marry somebody?" Oh yeah, he was maybe going to marry Elizabeth, Edward IV's daughter, and then you would have the York and the Lancaster allied to be like, this. He was going to be the Earl of Richmond, and Edward IV was going to like heal the wounds of the old war. But now people are like, that guy could be king,
right?
And so, Edward
and the wounds of the old war would be healed, like
that's
all
right.
kinds
all
of good stuff,
all kinds of good stuff.
And
he's like
a kid killer.
Yeah, and you don't have a kid, and you don't have Richard III who like killed a bunch of boys on the loose. And so people begin to like grumble, and Richard III is like, "Stop! I'm king. This is happening." And this is where we're gonna end our story right now. Is that Richard III has killed these boys, and it is just sad. Imagine like, I don't know, just being like a 9-year-old or a 12-year-old just in the tower, and you're like, that you're caught in this political game, but it's your uncle, so you like kind of don't believe it that he's gonna do something, but then like the door opens and there's a dude with a pillow. Like it's horrible. It's terrible. Anyway, so Richard Duke of Gloucester, Richard III, pretty pretty bloody and ruthless dude.
Yeah.
Well, here with your outro is the professional Thomas Magby. Take it away, Thomas.
Hello. I feel like the outro is pretty consistent, right? So hopefully this one's okay. Thank you for listening to Classical Stuff You Should Know. You can find us online at classicalstuff.net. You can find us on X at CLSSCAL Stuff. You can find us on Patreon, patreon.com/classicalstuff, where you can find in-between episodes, monthly AMAs, which are Ask Me Anythings, so where our patrons ask us questions and we answer them. You can email us, the guys, at classicalstuff.net. And I think that is everything.
Cool. We got one more Plantagenet, one more War of the Roses. We got one last one.
It's the end of an era.
Yeah.
It is, I know.
It makes me sad.
Crazy.
I want to know what's next after that.
It's coming. I don't know. Oh, I'm reading about the Gracchi brothers in ancient Rome. I might do something on that.
There you go.
Yeah, we haven't done a whole lot of Rome podcasts,
Yeah.
have we?
We're not very good for classical stuff. Yeah, probably should do more Rome.
We should do more Rome. I mean, if that's the thing that all men think of, what is it, like once a day? Every man thinks of the Rome.
You just
Roman
ask the
Empire
question,
at one
how,
time?
how often do you
All
think,
roads lead to Rome. So
Yeah.
all podcasts.
That was true, actually, for a long time.
Yeah.
All roads did lead to Rome.
Awesome.
But anyway, this has
Ciao.
been Classical Stuff. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.